Hey, TechKnowSurge. It's more important now than it ever has been before that we manage our data correctly. There's being more and more regulations and laws that are being put into place that make sure companies are managing their data well. So in this video, let's talk about data management. In this video, we'll start by going over data sovereignty and what data sovereignty is. Then we'll get into data roles and what are some of the roles involved with managing data. We'll talk about how we manage data. Then we'll get into ownership and who actually owns the data. We'll talk about inventory and retention and wrap things up by talking about right to be forgotten. Data sovereignty is the idea that there are authorities, like government entities, that creates laws and regulations on how we can capture and use data within an area. And that area could be just a local or regional level, or perhaps it's a state or province level. It could be a national or country level, or perhaps it's even a global level. But the idea is that if you have data for users within a certain area, then you have to fall under the laws and regulations of that area. We've defined several data roles, and we do that so that when we talk about data sovereignty and the expectations when it comes to managing the data, we know who's responsible for what and have this common language. As an example, we have the data subject. Let's say I go to a website and I'm typing in my address because I'm purchasing something and I want something delivered. Well, they are collecting my information, so I am the data subject in this example. Now, somebody is processing that data, is collecting and processing the data. That is the data processors. Now, a lot of times that data processors is also the person who are the data controllers, who has a say in what is happening to that data. Not always. Sometimes the data controllers pass off the processing to another third party. And so that is the data processors. But often the data controllers who's in charge of that data and the data processors are the same entity. Now the data controllers are going to appoint data stewards. These are the actual people and groups that are going to be controlling the data, that are going to be using the data to process that data. We also have the data custodians. They're the ones that are in charge of giving rights and permissions. Usually this is like the IT group right here. Let's look at it from a little different perspective. Let's look at it from an access management standpoint. We want to protect this data. So we have different roles within this. We have the users or stewards of this data who need access to this data so that way they can process information. The problem is you don't want people to just be able to elect, hey, I need access to this data and get access to that data. And you don't want to open it up to everyone within the company. And so what happens is you appoint a data owner. And the data owner is the one that's going to say yes or no on whether certain people get access to this data or not. And they're in charge of making sure that the right people have access to the data. But they're not necessarily in charge of controlling the access lists and the who is going to technically implement the protections in regards to safeguarding this data. That's going to be some sort of IT admin or system admin. So you got the data custodians. The data custodians are the ones that are actually managing the access list to there. And of course, we want to audit this process. So we have an auditor who's this outside party. Maybe it's the security department, maybe it's a third party, maybe it's some other company that's coming in to do the auditing, but they're going to make sure that all the rules are being followed and proper access is being maintained. Many laws and regulations are being put into place, such as GDPR, to control or mandate that there is a data protection officer. This is going to be a single person that's responsible out of all of these different rules for making sure that data is being safe and protected. A lot of laws and regulations are now defining who is the data ownership. And it used to be just assumed that whoever was the data controllers owned that data. So they would collect the data and then they would be in charge of controlling that data, and so they own that data. But more and more laws and regulations are saying that if you're collecting data from a subject, that they are actually the owners of that data, and you have the right to possibly use that data, but the ownership goes back to the data subject. And one of the reasons why that's important is that a lot of laws and regulations are saying that these data subjects have the right to be forgotten. That is, if you're collecting data from them, that they can come back and say, I don't want you to keep that data anymore. You must delete that data. So it's really important to understand what data we are collecting from our users, and we may need to perform some sort of data inventory to understand what data we have. And so that way, if a subject does request for us to remove that data, we're able to do that. We also need to consider the retention side of things. That is, we may take this data and be responsible for keeping records of that data for a certain period of time. And so maybe we put some of this data after we're done using it in some sort of archive. And this is important for a couple of reasons. We may be legally bound, or maybe our clients are demanding that we keep their data for a certain period of time. So if they need to do a restore or they need to do some sort of accountability check, they can do that. But at the same time, there's certain data that we may have to get rid of right away. And so we may have to go into those archives and delete data if a customer is requesting it. So it's really quite the balance of being able to make sure that we're retaining things for the proper period of time, but also removing data that we shouldn't be collecting any longer. If you're collecting data from a data subject, then you're responsible for knowing the laws and regulations of the data sovereignty of wherever that data subject lives. And so you have to keep that in mind when you're collecting that. And so we have these different data roles like data subject and data controllers to help explain who's responsible for the management of that data and how are you going to manage access to that data. And we also talked about ownership and who actually owns that data. Sometimes it's the data subject, sometimes it's the data controller. So it just depends on the scenario there. But more and more is being put on the data subject as them being the owner, so that way they can claim things like right to be forgotten. They can make a request to be forgotten and that you have to remove the data that in regards to that data subject. And then we also finish things up talking about inventory and retention and the importance of doing that to make sure that you comply with data sovereignty.